Jason, welcome along to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's always good to be here with you.
Yep, well, it's our first podcast of the year, getting into our first column of the year, titled, in this case, The TikTok Dilemma. And you talk about Trump as a savior, not America's savior, not our savior,
that's
but
right.
the savior of TikTok.
Funnily enough, yeah.
So take us back. We're in 2020 and Trump says TikTok no more. He lays an ultimatum out. He says by this date, you cannot do business in the United States of America. And here we are in 2025 and this conversation is still going. So fill in the blanks. What happened before this point and what's the situation now?
Yeah, because it seems a bit of an odd thing, right? He said, like, I open up by saying he saved TikTok, and then you wind back the clock 5 years into 2020 and he's like, TikTok must go. So what happened was the executive order that he signed was struck down by the courts and they said, no, can't do this. You can't do that. But then it went back through the Senate and the Congress, and they made the case that it was a very bad national security risk, and it got bipartisan support going through both houses. Mm-hmm. And that's the law that came into effect earlier this month. Last month, just January. And that's the law that meant that everyone on TikTok, all the influencers, are saying bye because we don't know what's happening. TikTok's going to go offline. And it did. It went offline for a couple of hours. There was a post that went up saying that due to legal reasons, we can't, we're not operating. It was kind of like a big sign saying, it's a real passive-aggressive sign on the web page. And then a couple of hours later, it came back online with a message saying, as a result of President Trump's efforts, TikTok is back in the US. All hail to the chief. That's right. And so he saved TikTok because so that's kind of where we're at. He's given it a reprieve. So there's a certain extension on the law, and they still have to try and find some buyers for the US, but then you wonder, is that actually what's going to happen, or is it just going to quietly go away again?
So in other words, nothing has really changed between 2020 and now. We're basically just gone back in time with the same issue. We're looking for a US buyer to purchase TikTok so that it can continue to operate.
In the US, yeah, that's right. And the odd thing, though, is that it's Trump's position that's totally reversed. So in 2020, he was, let's get rid of TikTok. Now we need to save it. It has to be saved, I think, is something he said.
Why do you think there's this change?
That's a good question. And I don't say that I'm a mind reader, but if I was going to be cynical, put my cynical hat on, some might say my realist hat, I would say it's politically motivated in that he credits TikTok. He's on TikTok and he has, I think, over 15 million followers. Wow. Young people, the main demographic on TikTok is very young people. And he has a lot of followers on TikTok, and he says it had an impact on the US election. So he credits it with helping bring him back. And so there is that he's popular, that a lot of his followers are on it, that I think there's talk of like taxes and income from the influencers and things like that. The super cynical person might say that, well, it just so happens that one of the Republican Party's major donors and the person who invests in Trump media also happens to be a major shareholder in ByteDance, which is the company that owns TikTok. So it could be something like that. But either way, and even if it's for, good for America motives, you get the sense that there is a security issue, there's a privacy issue, and for him to go and make a big deal about it 5 years ago and now say, oh, actually, it's not that bad, or just to ignore it and put it to the side is concerning. It's a bit worrying.
Okay, so we're not in America, so we can just leave that to the side.
Yes, that's a whole circus in itself.
Circus, sure. So we find ourselves in New Zealand. I mean, I've got nothing to hide. What's the big deal? These social media companies can take my data, and if they want to make something of it, fine. I mean, why should we care about our data security and privacy?
Yeah, so there's a couple of reasons. One particularly to do with TikTok, and that is the fact that in 2017, the Chinese government brought into law a couple of pieces of legislation that mean that any Chinese citizen and Chinese-owned company can be compelled in the interests of national security. And that term is broad enough that I guess the government could define whatever they want it to mean. Though those citizens or businesses can be compelled to hand information over to the government. So there's no law separating, like in America and New Zealand, we have quite a distinct separation between business and government. And in China, that's not the case.
Because if I remember correctly, the FBI wanted to get into an iPhone. Apple said no. There was a whole lot of litigation. And in the end, the FBI hacked the phone before the court case sort of ran its course.
Yeah.
But there is an example of a distinction between the government and the company, whereas you're suggesting that distinction doesn't necessarily exist in China?
No, it does on paper, but the law says that any Chinese citizen, any Chinese company is compelled, if the government asks, they have to give it over.
Right.
Which is the concern that there was a big hearing in Congress last year before Select Committee where they had the CEO of ByteDance and they asked him this and he said, we just won't hand it over. It's not as simple as that, I don't think. When you have an authoritarian, almost totalitarian regime, you don't really say no to them. So there is that concern. And because of that, governments around the world have said employees are not allowed to have TikTok on their phones because they gather information and that information could be handed over. But there's a wider social media app issue that kind of speaks to, I think, us in New Zealand, that there is a whole bunch of data that all of these companies gather. So there's biometric data that they collect, which is like images of you. So anytime you upload a photo to Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, anything, they collate that and they link it to you. And if it's taken with they have all the information on that photo, so they know it's taken with your phone. They know where it was taken, when it was taken, the exposure, all the metadata that goes with that image, they grab that. And so they know that if it was taken with your front-facing camera, that's your photo of you. So it matches with your profile picture. They know that's you. So then any other photo across the web, they can go, yes, that's this person, I can link. So they can backlink all your information across channels. They collect file and app information from your computer, from your phone, so they know what other apps you've got installed. They can read files that you've got there. They grab your contacts. They grab your keystrokes in some cases, which is very concerning if you're entering passwords or credit card data and things like that. And some apps, because they have filters built into the app, when you film yourself, you can put a little fun filter over your face or whatever. They can monitor, because they have access to your camera, and you give them access when you sign your user agreement. When you say, I accept the terms and conditions, you just scroll down to the bottom and hit accept. In there, they can have access to your camera and so therefore, and your microphone. And so they can have access to your, they can read and interpret your facial micro expressions to see how you are feeling, acting, behaving while you're interacting with the app. On top of just the data that they give you, that they take off your phone, then there's also your online activity. So how you interact with the app. The videos, the photos, the posts that you like, the comments you make, the direct messages that you send, your draft messages that you haven't sent, all these sort of things, they all have access. And I think when I started looking into this, I didn't realize that all this data on Facebook, on Instagram, on all the social media, on X, on WhatsApp, all that stuff is all available to the company to look at.
So taken together, these might seem like insignificant puzzle pieces, but actually these companies have access to all of it and they can pull it together, I guess, especially with the power of AI, to build quite a complete picture of us.
Yeah.
So
and there are companies in the European Union that have done this. When one of our research fellows, Paul Henderson, was doing his last paper on AI and democracy, he shared anecdotal stories with me about companies that reverse engineer your information from the bits and pieces scattered across the web. So it's like if you took a 1,000-piece puzzle and threw it across the room, these companies go and find each little piece and put it back together. Or if you took 5 puzzles and threw them across the room, they would find each piece, find out which puzzle it goes to, then put the puzzle back together and come up with your profile from your Google search history, from your YouTube, from your Facebook, from wherever. And they would put this psychographic profile of you back together. And then they're able to use that to target or to sell that data or to target you and do all sorts of things like that.
You mentioned in your column a Federal Trade Commission report that highlights many of these issues. So it's clear that this is nothing new. All social media users have an issue with data security, privacy. You're suggesting that TikTok's probably the worst offender. There's maybe a little bit more gray area.
Yes. Particularly because of the interconnection between the government and the company. Whereas in the Western countries, there's more of a separation.
Okay. So this is an issue then. What can we do about it?
Well, let's talk about personal, what we can personally do, because there's a bunch of stuff that governments could or maybe could not do, and legislation is very slow. It's always running behind. But things that we can do, there's at least 3 things. First, we can limit our data sharing. So there's permissions that these apps ask for that you can deny. So some of them will track you across other apps. They ask permission to do this. Usually when you install the app, they say, this app wants to track you across your phone, and you just say no. And you can go into your settings and the app settings and do that as well. Then you use privacy-focused tools. So VPNs like NordVPN or browsers that are focused on privacy like DuckDuckGo or Opera, and some of these have VPNs built in, and then get rid of any accounts that you don't use anymore, any fake Gmails that you may have set up, or maybe you haven't been on Facebook for a while and you want to cut that down. It won't get rid of the data, but it sort of breaks that connection between you and the data. So there's some practical things that we can do to take our autonomy back.
So the more data these companies have, the more they're able to influence us, nudge us, shape our perception of reality. The less we give them, obviously the inverse is true.
That's right. The better they know you, the better they know your preferences, the better they know the things that you like, the things that you don't like, and the more they're subtly able to shift that through their algorithm. So maybe they want to change your belief on a particular thing. They can push more content towards you from that perspective, or even stuff that's not 100% like that, but leans a little bit like that. You go, oh, actually, that's quite reasonable. Maybe I'll look into that a bit more, and they can do that through the algorithm, and that's just through your main feed. You'll just suddenly get a video that you're like, oh, I've never seen this. I've never heard of this person before, but I'll look at it, and they go, and then based on how you interact with that, they have that data, and they'll go, oh, they didn't really react well to that. We'll try this other video or this other piece of content that's similar but not exactly the same, and maybe they'll like that a bit more. And they just subtly shift and maneuver you. And these platforms are geared to keep your attention and to keep you interested, and also to polarize you, and kind of, because it's that sort of attention and outrage that gets some money from advertisers. So it's something to be very wary of.
Yeah, I had no idea that they could collect that much data. Yeah. So thank you for bringing that to our attention, and for offering some practical steps we can do to reduce our exposure. So great thoughts, Jason. Really appreciate your time on the podcast today.
No worries, mate. Glad to be here. President Trump has unexpectedly saved TikTok. After going dark for a few hours, the app came back online with the message, as a result of President Trump's efforts, TikTok is back in the US. This marks a dramatic departure from the president's first term, when he sought to ban the app outright, citing national security risks due to its ties to the Chinese company ByteDance. These concerns led several countries, including New Zealand, to ban TikTok from all government devices. A cynic, or realist, may characterize this flip-flop as self-interested. President Trump has almost 15 million followers on the platform, which boasts 170 million monthly American users and over 1 billion worldwide. He even credits TikTok for helping to secure his re-election, saying TikTok had an impact. Another motivation could be that one of Trump Media's investors, and a major Republican donor, has shares in ByteDance, TikTok's parent company. Whatever the reason, it is troubling that a nation's leader appears to have abandoned his worries about citizens' data for political gain. This raises several concerns and a few eyebrows. A damning 2024 report from the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, or FTC, makes it clear that we have a privacy problem. The FTC highlighted how prominent social media and video streaming companies engage in extensive surveillance of users, monetizing their personal information without providing adequate protection, especially for children and teenagers. TikTok and other social media companies collect more than just a name and email address. They also collect biometric data, images and fingerprints, file and app information and keystrokes, and they can potentially monitor facial expressions in real time. At Maxim Institute, we recognize these risks, which is why we use a dedicated phone solely for social media engagement, minimizing data exposure. The question isn't just what data they collect, but how they use it to shape your reality, often in ways you don't realize. The private data collected by these platforms doesn't just sell you products, it shapes your opinions, decisions, and worldview, leaving you vulnerable to invisible, perception-shaping forces. Your data fuels algorithms that prioritize interactions with like-minded individuals, driving fragmentation and polarization. As platforms collect more data, their influence over users only grows. This all sounds, well, Orwellian. So what can you do? At least 3 things. First, limit data sharing. Review the permissions granted to apps on your devices and disable unnecessary ones. Avoid sharing sensitive information on platforms unless absolutely required. Second, use privacy-focused tools like the DuckDuckGo browser or VPNs like NordVPN or ExpressVPN. Third, delete any unnecessary or unused accounts. While this won't erase your digital footprint entirely, it reduces the amount of data available to exploit. When we blithely give away our data, we empower systems that don't have our best interests at heart. By denying unnecessary access to our data, we push back against those who seek to control our digital lives. It's time to pick up our phones and change some permissions.